Imagine finishing reading the prophet Malachi, closing your eyes for just a moment and then they are gone again. The Persian Empire no longer dominates as it used to. The Greek language is now heard on the streets. Jerusalem was invaded, recovered, desecrated, and consecrated again. New religious groups emerged. Rome extended its claws over Judea. A king named Herod rules with luxury, fear, and cruelty. The people continued to attend the temple, offering sacrifices, reading the scriptures, and repeating ancient promises. But one question seems to cross each generation: when will God speak again? This is how we enter one of the most mysterious periods in all of biblical history. Between the last page of the Old Testament and the first page of the New Testament, there is a space that many people cross without realizing it. We finish Malachi and find a people living under Persian rule. We turn a few pages, and suddenly, we arrive at the Gospel of Matthew. Now there are Pharisees, Sadducees, synagogues, doctors of the law, Roman rule, soldiers scattered throughout the cities, tax collectors, a king called Herod, and multitudes waiting for the arrival of the Messiah. Where did all this come from? What happened during those centuries? Has God really been silent? And perhaps the deepest question is this: did God's silence mean that he had abandoned his people? Or was it that, while no one could hear a new prophetic voice, God was preparing every detail for the arrival of Jesus? This is the story we will go through together. And stay until the end, because understanding what happened between Malachi and Jesus completely changes the way we see the Gospels. Many words, conflicts, and events in the life of Christ gain a different depth when we discover the world that was waiting for him. The so-called period of 400 years of silence does not mean that nothing happened. It also does not mean that God stopped acting. The expression refers mainly to the absence of a new prophetic voice, recognized in the scriptures by many Christian traditions. There was no Isaiah standing up before kings. There was no Jeremiah announcing a message to the nation. There was no prophet like Elijah openly confronting the powerful and declaring, "Thus says the Lord." But the prophetic silence was not a historical void. In fact, those centuries were marked by wars, revolutions, persecutions, religious disputes, cultural changes, and a growing expectation for the coming of the Messiah. It was as if the stage was being set behind a large curtain. The public couldn't see everything that was happening behind the scenes, but each piece was being placed in its place. When the curtain finally opened, there was a heavenly army marching on Jerusalem. A king surrounded by soldiers did not appear. There were no trumpets blown by the rulers of the earth. A boy appeared. A boy lying in a manger. Before we understand why that birth happened at that time, we need to go back to the end of the Old Testament. The people of Judah had experienced one of the greatest tragedies in their history. Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonians. Solomon's temple had been burned. Many Jews were taken into exile. The land that symbolized the promise seemed lost, and the city that represented God's presence was in ruins. Decades later, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians. Cyrus, king of Persia, allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This seemed like the beginning of a glorious restoration. Many believed that the old promises would finally be fulfilled in all their greatness. But the reality was more difficult. The temple was rebuilt, but it did not have the same magnificence as Solomon's temple. Jerusalem was inhabited again, but the people continued to be subjected to a foreign empire. Religious life was re-established, but corruption, spiritual coldness, and injustice remained present. It was in this environment that Malachi transmitted his message. The people still offered sacrifices, but many did so without reverence. Some priests treated sacred things with contempt. There was infidelity, injustice, and a religion practiced out of obligation. People continued to perform ceremonies, but their hearts were far away. Malachi confronted this superficiality. He denounced negligent priests, condemned injustice, and reminded the people that God was not pleased with empty worship. However, the book does not end with just a rebuke. It ends with expectation. Malachi talks about the arrival of a messenger who would prepare the way. He points to a day when God would act decisively again. The people should remember the law, remain faithful, and wait. Then, the prophetic voice falls silent. No date has been announced. No generation was guaranteed that they would see compliance. The people had a promise, but they did not have a calendar. And perhaps that is exactly where this period begins to speak to us. It's easy to trust when we receive quick answers. It's easy to believe when events seem to go the way we expected. The real challenge arises when God makes a promise, but does not reveal how long it will take for it to be fulfilled. A generation listened to Malachi and died without seeing the messenger. Then came another generation, and another. Parents told their children the promises. These children grew up, grew old, and repeated the same words to their own descendants. Centuries passed, and the promise remained. Maybe some people started to doubt. Perhaps someone has asked, "Our ancestors waited, and nothing happened. Why should we keep waiting?" Others may have thought that the promises were just memories from a distant past. But the absence of a new message did not nullify what God had already said. While the people waited, Persian rule continued. Jews had a certain freedom to practice their religion, maintain the temple, and organize community life. However, they were not fully independent. They lived in their land, but were subject to foreign authorities. During this period, the law of Moses became even more central to the identity of the people. After the trauma of exile, many Jews understood that they needed to preserve their faith, traditions, and scriptures. Priests, scribes, and teachers assumed increasing importance. Not all Jews had returned to Jerusalem. Jewish communities continued to be spread across different regions. This spread, known as diaspora, would make the Jewish faith present far beyond the borders of Judea. This would be extremely important in the future. Centuries later, when the disciples began to announce Jesus' message, they would find Jewish communities in several cities throughout the Mediterranean world. They would find people who knew the scriptures, waited for the promises, and attended meeting places where the word was read. The scenario was not yet complete, but an invisible road was beginning to be built. If you like discovering these details that connect the Old and New Testaments, subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell, so you don't miss the next videos in which we will continue delving into the events, symbols, and teachings that often go unnoticed during a quick reading of the Bible. For approximately 2 centuries, the Persians dominated much of the East. They seemed too strong to be defeated. Its kings controlled immense territories, had powerful armies, and administered different peoples. But in the 4th century BC, a new force emerged from the West. Their leader was young, ambitious, and extraordinarily skilled in warfare. His name was Alexander, known to history as Alexander the Great. Within a few years, Alexander defeated the Persians and built an empire that stretched from Greece to distant regions of Asia. His advance was so rapid that it seemed impossible to resist. Judea also came under Greek influence. Alexander didn't just conquer territories. Wherever he went, he brought Hellenistic culture. The Greek language, philosophy, art, customs, educational models, and the Greek worldview spread throughout the conquered regions. This change was profound. Until that moment, Jews had lived under empires that allowed some preservation of their identity. Now they faced an extremely attractive, sophisticated, and influential culture. Hellenism featured gymnasiums, competitions, theaters, new ways of thinking, and a language capable of connecting different peoples. For some Jews, approaching this culture seemed like an opportunity for progress. For others, it was a threat to their covenant with God. A tension began that would remain alive until the days of Jesus. How to live in the midst of a dominant culture without losing one's own spiritual identity. Some Jews adopted Greek names. Others learned the language and incorporated foreign customs. Certain influential families wanted to be seen as modern and civilized. To them, the old customs seemed outdated. Others resisted. Circumcision, the Sabbath, dietary rules, and worship of the only God distinguished the Jews from other peoples. Abandoning these practices was not just about changing habits. For many, it meant breaking the covenant received from their ancestors. It is important to realize that the conflict was not simply between Jews and foreigners. It often happened within the Jewish community itself. On one side were those who wanted greater adaptation to Greek culture. On the other, those who believed that this adaptation would lead to infidelity. This dispute would leave deep marks. However, the expansion of the Greek language would also produce something that would later be essential for the spread of the Christian message. Greek became something of a common language throughout much of the Mediterranean world. People from different regions could communicate using the same language. When the Gospels and letters of the New Testament were written, Greek allowed the message to cross borders much more easily. The same process contributed to the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, known as the Septuagint. This translation became very important among Jews who lived outside Judea and no longer mastered Hebrew in the same way. Thus, even without a new prophetic voice, the old words began to reach new people in new places. What seemed like just a political and cultural change was preparing a linguistic bridge. One day, disciples would leave Jerusalem announcing that Jesus had risen. They would find roads built by empires, cities connected by trade, and a language understood across vast regions. None of those rulers imagined they were contributing to this. Alexander believed he was building his own glory. Generals thought about power, merchants thought about wealth, but beyond human intentions, history was heading towards an appointment. Alexander died young in 323 BC, without leaving a successor capable of keeping the empire together. His generals began to dispute the conquered territories. The great empire was divided, and Judea ended up caught between two main forces. To the south, in Egypt, the Ptolemies ruled. To the north, in Syria, the Seleucids ruled. Judea was precisely between these two centers of power. It was a small region, but it had enormous strategic importance. Armies marching between Egypt and Syria often crossed their lands. Imagine living in a place where larger empires decide your fate without consulting you. A war began in the north, and families in Judea suffered. A king made an alliance in the south, and new taxes were levied. An army won, and the ruler changed. Shortly afterwards, another army returned, and everything changed again. During part of Ptolemaic rule, Jews enjoyed relative religious freedom. The Jewish community also grew in Egypt, especially in Alexandria, one of the most important cities in the ancient world. Alexandria was a center of knowledge, commerce, and culture. People of different origins lived there, and many Jews learned to live within a multicultural society without completely abandoning their faith. It was in this environment that the Greek translation of the scriptures gained great importance. Jews who already spoke Greek could hear the law and the prophets in a language they understood. Centuries later, many followers of Jesus would use this translation when announcing the gospel. Note the great irony of the story. Greek culture could be used to alienate some Jews from their traditions, but the Greek language would also help bring the scriptures and the message of Christ to countless people. The same road could be used for both seduction and mission. The same language could transmit pagan philosophy or announce that the word had become flesh. The tool did not determine the message. The heart of those who used it made all the difference. After many disputes, the Seleucids gained control of Judea. At first, this change did not seem to mean an immediate destruction of Jewish religious life. However, as time passed, tensions increased. Then a ruler emerged whose name would become a symbol of persecution and desecration, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus wanted to strengthen his kingdom and increase cultural unity. At the same time, within Jerusalem, rival groups vied for power and influence. The position of high priest, which was supposed to represent a spiritual responsibility, became embroiled in political negotiations. Ambitious men sought office not only to serve before God, but to control wealth, prestige, and authority. This is an essential detail for us to understand the New Testament. When Jesus confronts corrupt religious leadership, he is not speaking from within a system that had become problematic overnight. Centuries of political disputes, alliances with foreign rulers, and struggles for power had deeply affected some institutions. The high priesthood was no longer seen simply as a sacred calling linked to dissent and service. At certain times, it became a position manipulated by political interests. Antiochus interfered in these disputes and tried to impose a more aggressive Hellenization. Fundamental practices of the Jewish faith were banned. Sabbath observance, circumcision, and the study of the law suffered persecution. Taion. Copies of the scriptures were destroyed. The Temple of Jerusalem was desecrated. For a faithful Jew, this was not just a military invasion. It was an attack on his relationship with God. The temple was no ordinary building. It represented the center of national worship. There sacrifices were offered. There people celebrated festivals. There was the memory of the alliance. When a foreign ruler desecrated that place, the message was clear. He wanted to demonstrate that he had authority even over what the Jews considered sacred. Many people gave in. Some were afraid of dying. Others were already seduced by the dominant culture. There were also those who tried to hide their loyalty. But some families decided to resist. In a small town called Modim, an elderly priest named Mattathias refused to participate in a pagan sacrifice. His decision triggered a revolt. He and his sons fled to the mountainous regions, where they began to gather people willing to fight for the law, the alliance, and the freedom to worship. Among the sons of Mattathias, Judas stood out, who received the nickname Maccabeus. The Maccabean revolt did not begin with a large organized army. It started with people who refused to let an empire define who they should believe. The rebels knew the mountains, used quick attacks, and faced much larger forces. For them, the fight was not just about territory, it was about identity. Many died. Families were persecuted. People were forced to choose between security and fidelity. These events help explain why, in Jesus' day, the Jewish people were so sensitive to the presence of foreigners, and so attentive to any sign of cultural or religious dominance. The memory of the persecution has not disappeared. Every Roman soldier on the streets could awaken memories of former oppressors. Every pagan symbol could represent a threat. Each ruler who interfered in the temple seemed to repeat a painful history. Against all expectations, Judas Maccabeus and his followers won important victories. Jerusalem was recovered and the temple was purified and rededicated in the year 164 BC. This rededication began to be celebrated on the Feast of Hanukkah, and John mentions Jesus walking through the temple during the Feast of the Dedication. This small reference connects Christ directly to the memory of that period. When people celebrated the dedication, they remembered that the temple had been desecrated by an oppressor and then consecrated again. Then Jesus appears in that same environment, and in the course of his ministry, he speaks of his own body as the true temple. He announces a presence of God that could not be controlled by empires, purchased by corrupt priests, or destroyed by human hands. The victory of the Maccabees brought hope. For the first time in a long time, many Jews felt they could regain independence. But every human victory carries a danger. Those who fight corruption may later be seduced by the same power they condemned. After the revolt, the Hasmonean dynasty emerged, linked to the Maccabees family. For a time, Judea experienced a form of independence. Its rulers expanded territories, strengthened the state, and assumed political and religious functions. It seemed like the former glory was returning. However, internal conflicts began to emerge. Hasmonean rulers accumulated power as kings and high priests. This generated opposition because, according to tradition, the expected king should be linked to David's lineage, while the priesthood had another origin. The mix between throne and altar became increasingly problematic. Family disputes, ambition, violence, and political alliances weakened the dynasty. Instead of uniting the people, the rulers began to divide society. It was in this environment that different religious groups gained strength. The Gospels present Pharisees and Sadducees as if the reader already knew who they were. However, these groups do not appear with these names in the Old Testament. They took shape during the period between Malachi and Jesus. The Pharisees were linked to a deep concern with fidelity to the law. They believed that people needed to preserve their holiness even while living under foreign influence. The name was probably related to the idea of separation. Not necessarily physical separation from all people, but separation from practices considered impure. Many Pharisees valued both the written law and interpretive traditions passed down by teachers. They sought to apply the commandments to everyday life situations. They also believed in the resurrection of the dead, the existence of angels, and a future judgment. It is important not to transform all Pharisees into simple or identical characters. Some were sincere in their search for God. Others became proud and legalistic. Some demonstrated hostility toward Jesus. Others sought him out to talk. Nicodemus, for example, was a Pharisee. Later, the Apostle Paul would also say that he had belonged to this group. The problem Jesus confronted was not the desire to obey God. Christ never condemned anyone for taking holiness seriously. The problem arose when external rules were used to hide a distant heart, when human tradition was given more weight than mercy, when someone obeyed to be admired, when religion stopped leading to God and became an instrument of superiority. The Pharisees were born in a period in which preserving identity was a matter of survival. This helps to understand his concern with purity, the Sabbath, food, and contact with foreigners. However, a necessary defense could turn into a wall. A practice created to protect faith could prevent a person from recognizing the Messiah himself. The Sadducees represented another sector of society. They were more linked to the priestly aristocracy and the functioning of the temple. Many rich and influential families were close to this group. Unlike the Pharisees, the Sadducees did not accept all the same religious interpretations. The Gospels and the Book of Acts show that they rejected the belief in the resurrection as taught by the Pharisees. They possessed great political influence, especially because the temple was not just a religious center, it was also an economic and social center. Because they were linked to power structures, Sadducees often sought to maintain a careful relationship with foreign rulers. A revolt against Rome could destroy the system they were part of. Thus, when Jesus begins to attract crowds, purify the temple, and denounce abuses, he does not just threaten some religious ideas. It touches on economic interests, social prestige, and political stability. This is why certain leaders conclude that Jesus needs to be stopped. They fear his message will provoke a Roman reaction. They fear losing control. They fear that the people will recognize an authority that does not depend on their authorization. While Pharisees and Sadducees fought over interpretation and influence, other Jews chose a life of seclusion. Among them were groups normally associated with the Essenes. Some lived in more isolated communities seeking purity, discipline, prayer, and preparation for divine intervention in history. Many scholars link a community of this type to manuscripts found near the Dead Sea at Qumran. These texts reveal people deeply concerned about the corruption of the priesthood, the battle between light and darkness, and the arrival of a decisive time. They believed they were living in the last days of a great spiritual struggle. They expected God to purify his people. They were awaiting trial. They expected anointed figures. They expected a new era. Even though Jesus did not belong to these communities, their existence shows how spiritual expectation was growing. Prophetic silence had not erased hope. In some hearts, it made it even more intense. There were also Jews who believed it was impossible to live peacefully with foreign rule. For them, accepting taxes, Roman symbols, or rulers chosen by Rome could be seen as treason. These resistance tendencies, which would later be associated with revolutionary movements and zealots, fueled the dream of national liberation. When they talked about the Messiah, many imagined a political liberator. They expected a new David, a warrior, a king capable of expelling foreigners and restoring Israel's sovereignty. This expectation helps to understand some reactions to Jesus. When Christ feeds a multitude, certain people want to make him king. When he enters Jerusalem, many receive him with enthusiasm. When he is arrested and does not summon an army, some are confused. When he dies on a Roman cross, the disciples feel that their hopes have been destroyed. They expected deliverance, but they still did not understand how Jesus would win. The Messiah would not ignore oppression, but would attack an even deeper root. He would not destroy Rome with swords. He would confront sin, fear, death, and everything that imprisons the human heart. If this part of the story is already helping you better understand the world Jesus was born into, share this video with someone who also loves studying the Bible. Many read the Gospels for years without discovering where the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the messianic expectation, and the conflicts that surrounded the temple came from. A simple share can make this message reach a person who was looking for exactly this explanation. During the Hasmonean government, the internal visions increased. Members of the royal family themselves began to compete for the throne. Two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, clashed for power. Instead of resolving the dispute within the nation, they sought external support. This was a mistake that would change the history of Judea. At that time, Rome was growing rapidly and expanding its influence across the Mediterranean. A Roman general named Pompey was reorganizing territories in the east. Jewish rivals presented their interests to the Romans, hoping that Rome would support one side. But great empires rarely enter a dispute just to help. They come into control. In the year 63 BC, Pompey conquered Jerusalem. Jewish independence was deeply shaken, and Judea entered the sphere of Roman rule. To enter the most sacred place in the temple, something that caused enormous outrage. Although he did not destroy the sanctuary at that time, his entry symbolized the humiliation of a nation that a short time before believed it had regained its freedom. Once again, Jerusalem was subject to foreigners. Once again, soldiers of another people walked through the land of promise. Once again, the question returned, where is the kingdom of God? Rome had a different structure from previous empires. Their armies were disciplined. Its roads connected distant regions. Its political and administrative system allowed it to control different peoples. The Roman presence brought some stability to travel and trade in some regions, but this stability came at a price. Heavy taxes were levied. Governors had broad authority. Revolts were repressed with violence. The crucifixion became a terrible symbol of Roman power. It wasn't just a form of execution, it was a public message. Rome wanted everyone to know what happened to anyone who challenged its authority. Decades later, Jesus would be taken out of Jerusalem and crucified with a political charge written on his head, King of the Jews. The cross seemed to declare that Rome had defeated yet another suitor, but what Rome saw as defeat would become the center of a message that would cross the empire. The instrument created to spread fear would now announce hope. Execution designed to erase a name would cause that name to be proclaimed among the nations. Before the arrival of Jesus, however, another character would dominate Judea. Herod, known as Herod the Great, rose to power with Roman support. He did not belong to the ancient line of David. His family was of Idumean origin, and its legitimacy was questioned by many Jews. Herod understood that he needed to earn respect and, at the same time, maintain Rome's trust. He was politically skilled, ambitious, and capable of carrying out major projects. He built fortresses, palaces, cities, and ports. His most famous work was the enormous expansion of the temple in Jerusalem. The temple rebuilt after the exile was simple compared to Solomon's former glory. Herod decided to transform it into a monumental building. The project took many years. Large stones were used, courtyards were expanded. Pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem were impressed. This was the temple that appears in the Gospels. When the disciples admire the buildings and show the stones to Jesus, they are looking at Herod's work. But there is something deeply symbolic about it. The man who expanded the temple was not known for a heart dedicated to God. Herod could make the building bigger, but he could not produce true worship. It could cover stones with beauty, but it could not purify human intentions. He could build courtyards, but he could not open the inner path that leads to the divine presence. This contradiction runs through the entire biblical story. It is possible to build something great in the name of God and still keep your heart dominated by fear, pride, and violence. Herod was suspicious. He feared losing the throne. I suspected family members. He eliminated people he considered threats. He ordered the execution of members of his own family, including his wife and some children. Power did not bring him peace. The more he owned, the more he feared losing. When the wise men arrived in Jerusalem asking where the one who had been born king of the Jews was, Herod was disturbed. The question touched exactly on his greatest insecurity. He had received the title and power from Rome, but he knew that he was not the king promised by the scriptures. A boy born far from the palace posed a greater threat than an army, because he carried a legitimacy that Herod could never buy. The king who built fortresses was afraid of a child. The man protected by soldiers trembled before a prophecy. He who ruled Jerusalem could not control God's plan. Herod represents human power trying to get rid of it at any cost. Jesus represents the kingdom that does not need violence to prove its authority. Herod clings to the throne. Jesus is born in a manger. Herod eliminates rivals. Jesus gives his own life. Herod builds to exalt his name. Jesus serves, touches the forgotten, and washes the feet of the disciples. Herod appears great in the eyes of the world. Jesus arrives small, silent, and almost unnoticed. But which of the two still transforms lives? During those centuries, the daily life of the Jewish people also changed. The synagogue gained enormous importance. It did not replace the temple, especially since the sacrifices continued to be linked to Jerusalem. However, it allowed communities to meet for prayer, scripture reading, and teaching. Jews scattered throughout other cities could not travel constantly to the temple. They needed places where faith could be taught and preserved. In the Gospels, Jesus enters synagogues, reads the scriptures, and teaches. Paul, during his travels, also often begins his work in the synagogues. There he finds people familiar with Moses, the prophets, and the hope of Israel. Once again, something developed during the centuries of silence becomes a door to the proclamation of the message. When Jesus arrives in Nazareth and enters the synagogue, he is not entering an institution that appeared suddenly. You are participating in a form of community life that has been strengthened over generations. There, in front of people who had known him since childhood, he read a prophetic passage and announced that that word was being fulfilled. After centuries of waiting, the fulfillment was sitting before them. But proximity can make us blind. They knew his family. They knew his city. Perhaps they had seen Jesus working. Therefore, they had difficulty recognizing that the time had arrived. They expected something distant, spectacular, and impossible to ignore. But God set the greeting before them with a familiar face. During the 400 years, scribes also rose to prominence. Copying the scriptures was a job that required enormous care. As there were no printers, each copy had to be made manually. Scribes were not just copyists. Many became experts in interpreting the law. The people sought them out to understand commandments, traditions, and religious issues. When Jesus teaches, the crowds notice a difference. He doesn't just speak by repeating opinions of ancient masters. Speak with authority. This does not mean that he was ignorant of the scriptures. On the contrary, his message was deeply rooted in them. But Jesus did not treat the word as a labyrinth created to impress listeners. It revealed its center. Love God. Love your neighbor. Practice justice. Show mercy. Experience a transformation that begins within and reaches the entire existence. Over the centuries, different interpretations had accumulated. Discussions arose about the Sabbath, purity, vows, food, divorce, and countless situations. Jesus enters this universe and does not offer just another opinion. He leads people to divine intention. When you heal on Saturday, you are not despising the holy day. It is showing that the Sabbath was given as a blessing, not as a prison. When he touches a leper, he is not treating holiness with contempt. It is showing that his purity is able to overcome impurity. When he eats with sinners, he does not approve of sin. It reveals that mercy seeks those who are lost. When you forgive, you do not diminish justice. Take upon yourself the path of reconciliation. When he calls God Father, he invites people to an intimacy that many have forgotten. The people knew laws, sacrifices, festivals, and traditions. But Jesus would reveal the heart of the Father. Another important change happened in the language. In Jesus' time, different languages could be heard in the region. Aramaic was used widely in everyday life. Hebrew remained linked to the scriptures and religious life. Greek was known in many areas because of the long Hellenistic influence. Latin was associated with Roman administration, although it was not necessarily the everyday language of the majority. This explains why the inscription placed on Jesus' cross was presented in more than one language. The execution took place in Judea, but the message could be understood by people from different backgrounds. It also helps to understand how, after the resurrection, the Christian faith quickly crossed cultural barriers. The first disciples were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. The scriptures they proclaimed were the scriptures of Israel. However, the Greek language allowed the testimony to reach distant peoples. The New Testament would be written primarily in Greek. Letters would cross cities. Copies would be taken by travelers. Different communities would read the same message. The empire believed that its trains existed to move soldiers, collect taxes, and transport wealth. The disciples would use these same roads to announce the gospel. Rome built paths to expand Caesar's power. God would allow these paths to serve the proclamation of another king. This does not mean that empires were just or that all violence was part of a God-approved plan. The Bible never demands that we call evil good. It means that not even the arrogance of the powerful can stop God from redeeming situations and opening paths. Rulers made decisions out of ambition. Generals marched for glory. Merchants traveled for profit. But in the midst of these human motivations, an international scenario was being formed: a common language, travel routes, scattered Jewish communities, translated scriptures, established synagogues, growing messianic expectation, foreign domination generating a thirst for liberation, religious debates that prepared fundamental questions. Everything was ready for Jesus' message to be heard, confronted, and then taken to the nations. When we just look at the silence, we may think that nothing was happening. When we look at the entire story, we see movement in all directions. This is one of the great teachings of this period. God does not only work when we can immediately identify His voice. There are moments when His action is visible, like a sea parting. In others, it looks like an ordinary sequence of events. A language that spreads, a growing city, a road that is built, a family that keeps a promise, a scribe who copies a text, a mother teaching her son a prayer, a people who continue to celebrate a party even after so many defeats. None of these isolated events seem grand. Together they preserved hope until the right time arrived. In the days before the birth of Jesus, Judea lived a mixture of faith, fear, and expectation. The people bore the burden of taxes. Roman soldiers were reminded daily of who had political control. Herod maintained power with foreign support. Religious leaders were divided. Some people tried to survive without attracting attention. Others expected a revolution. Some sought purity in the desert. Others negotiated with Rome. Some studied prophecies. Others may no longer believe they would see any change. Then, in a small village in Galilee, an angel appears to a young girl named Mary. He does not appear first to the high priest. Do not enter Herod's palace. Don't look for the Roman commander. The message reaches a young woman unknown to most of the world. She receives the announcement that she will give birth to a son whose kingdom will have no end. The promise begins to be fulfilled far from the centers of power. At the same time, a priest named Zechariah enters the temple to perform his service. He and his wife Isabel were already elderly and had no children. Inside the sanctuary, Zechariah receives news that Elizabeth will give birth to a boy. This boy would prepare the people. His name would be John. Notice how the silence ends. Malachi had spoken of a messenger who would prepare the way. Centuries pass. Then in the same temple that went through reconstructions, profanations, rededications, and expansions, an angel announces the birth of the precursor. Zacharias doubts and is unable to speak. It is as if the silence of a nation was represented in the silence of a priest. For months he is unable to pronounce words. When the boy is born and receives the indicated name, Zechariah's voice returns. The silence is broken with praise and prophecy. Afterwards, Juan grows up and goes to the desert. Don't wear luxurious clothes. It does not seek approval from authorities. He doesn't receive his calling in a palace. His voice echoes far from the structures that had accumulated power. Prepare the way. After centuries without a prophet like the ancients, a voice cries out again. People leave the cities to listen to him. Soldiers look for him. Tax collectors ask questions. Religious leaders appear. John calls everyone to repentance. He doesn't offer a comfortable message. It does not say that belonging to the people of the covenant is enough. It does not allow traditions to be used as a hiding place. He demands fruit. It demands change. It demands that life correspond to the declared faith. Juan is the bridge between two times. It carries the firmness of the ancient prophets and points to someone greater. He knows that his mission is not to attract everyone to himself. Your voice exists to direct eyes to Jesus. When he sees Christ approaching, John announces that there is the one who will bear the sin of the world. Silence does not end with just words. It ends with the introduction of a person. For centuries, people asked when God would speak again. The answer didn't just come through another read prophetic view. It came through the Son. Jesus is not simply another messenger in a long sequence. He is the revelation of God entering human history. The prophets said, "Hear the word of the Lord." Jesus speaks and acts with an authority that leaves everyone impressed. He forgives sins, touches the unclean, calms storms, confronts spiritual forces, calls the dead back to life. And he declares that whoever sees him begins to understand the Father himself. The Gospel of John describes Jesus as the Word made flesh. This offers a powerful image for the silent years. The Word had not disappeared. She was about to dwell among us. Heaven had not forgotten earth. God was preparing the most profound form of communication. Not just a voice sent from afar, but his presence entering the human condition. Jesus is born during the rule of Herod and under the authority of Rome. This is not an unimportant detail. He enters a world controlled by empires. He grows up among a people marked by occupation. He knows about work, tiredness, poverty, and the tensions of an unequal society. Your family needs to travel because of an administrative order. Later, he needs to escape the violence of a threatened king. Jesus does not observe human suffering from a safe distance. He enters it. The Son of God is not born in an ideal time. He does not wait for politics to become fair. He does not expect all priests to be faithful. He doesn't expect the people to be united. Don't expect the world to be at peace. He is born in the midst of confusion. This truth is fundamental. Many people believe that God can only start something when all conditions are favorable. They wait for the problems to end. Let the family get organized. May the fear disappear. May the doubts be resolved. May the environment become perfect. But the birth of Jesus shows that God can begin his work in the center of a broken reality. Bethlehem was full. Accommodation was insufficient. Herod was dangerous. Rome dominated. Religion was divided. Even so, the promise was born. Maybe the scenario wasn't comfortable, but the time was set. The Apostle Paul would later use a profound expression. When the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son. Fullness of time did not mean that the world had reached perfection. It means the moment had matured. Greek culture had spread a common language. Rome had connected regions by roads and sea routes. The Jewish diaspora had brought knowledge of the scriptures to many cities. Synagogues provided spaces where the message could be announced. Foreign domination had intensified hope for liberation. The ancient prophecies continued to be preserved. The people were tired of human kings incapable of producing lasting justice. Then Jesus arrived. History shows that God is not late, even though it often seems slow to us. A promise can span generations before it blossoms. This is difficult to accept because we measure time by the length of our own lives. We want to plant and harvest immediately. We want to pray and receive the answer instantly. We want to understand the purpose while we are still living the process. But biblical history has a greater horizon. One generation can start something that another will continue. Someone preserves a manuscript without imagining who will read it. A family transmits faith without knowing that a descendant will participate in something extraordinary. A community builds a synagogue without imagining that decades later, an apostle will announce Jesus in that place. What seems small can be part of a bigger story than we can see. This does not mean that all suffering should be romanticized. Antiochus's persecution was real. Wars killed people. Roman oppression hurt families. Religious ambition corrupted institutions. God does not need human wickedness to accomplish his purposes. However, human evil also does not have the power to definitively cancel what God has decided to do. That's the point. Evil can hurt. It can delay human paths, can destroy buildings. It can silence witnesses. It can persecute communities. But he cannot take the place of God. Antiochus tried to erase the Jewish faith, and resistance strengthened the people's identity. Rome placed Jesus on a cross, and the resurrection transformed the cross into an announcement of victory. Herod tried to preserve his throne, but his kingdom ended. Jesus did not have a palace, but his kingdom continues to reach hearts. The empires of that period seemed permanent. Where are they today? The Persian Empire fell. Alexander's empire was divided. The Ptolemies disappeared. The Seleucids lost power. The Hasmonean dynasty came into conflict. Rome also fell. But the words spoken by Jesus continued are being read, taught, questioned, and lived in all parts of the world. This should transform our perception of true power. At that time, Caesar seemed to control history. Herod seemed to control Judea. The priests seemed to control the temple. The soldiers seemed to control the streets. But neither of them controlled the future. History did not end with Caesar on the throne. It ended with disciples announcing that Jesus is Lord. When you read the Gospels without knowing the previous centuries, you might think that the discussions arose suddenly. Why was there so much tension about the Sabbath? Why was purity so important? Why did some people hate tax collectors? Why did the crowd want a king? Why did the temple have so much political weight? Why did the leaders fear a Roman reaction? Why did the resurrection provoke debate between Pharisees and Sadducees? The answers are hidden in these 4 centuries. The people had survived exile. Then it faced Greek influence. He saw his temple being desecrated. He fought to get it back. He experienced independence. It lost that independence to Rome. He became suspicious of any threat to national identity. It developed traditions to protect the faith, created alliances to preserve institutions, waited for a liberator. Then Jesus arrived and challenged all categories. The Pharisees expected holiness, and Jesus presented a holiness that touched sinners. The Sadducees protected the temple, and Jesus declared that something greater than the temple was there. The revolutionaries expected a sword, and Jesus told them to love their enemies. The crowds were waiting for bread, and Jesus offered himself. Scholars expected answers, and he asked heart-bearing questions. The powerful expected submission, and he announced the kingdom of God. The disciples expected victory without suffering, and he walked to the cross. Everyone expected God to act. Few recognized the way he decided to act. This is perhaps one of the most perplexing parts of faith. We can wait so long for a response that we create a rigid image of how it needs to arrive. When the answer finally appears differently, we run the risk of rejecting it. Many were waiting for the Messiah. They knew promises. They attended parties. Read the prophets. They prayed for deliverance. But when Jesus appeared, he did not meet all the political and religious expectations built over the centuries. He came from Galilee. I hung out with simple people. He welcomed women among his followers. He approached people considered unclean. He did not seek support from the elites. He did not ask permission from the powerful. It talked about an inner transformation. He proclaimed that the kingdom was at hand, forgave, it healed, restored, and he denounced hypocrisy wherever it was. Some recognized in him the answer they were waiting for. Others decided that he needed to be eliminated. The same silence that produced expectation also produced human interpretations. Some were sincere. Others served interests. Therefore, the arrival of the word requires discernment. Don't just wait. We must be willing to allow God to correct the way we expect. Old Simeon represents someone who waited with an open heart. He did not occupy a throne. He didn't lead an army, does not appear as a religious celebrity. But he awaited the consolation of Israel. When Mary and Joseph took Jesus to the temple, Simeon recognized in that boy the fulfillment of hope. What a contrast. Priests walked through the temple daily. Visitors admired the construction. Merchants were busy in the courtyards. Leaders discussed religious issues. In the midst of them all, an elderly man held the boy and realized that salvation had arrived. Anna, an elderly prophetess, also recognized the moment. She had spent years in prayer and worship. When he saw Jesus, he began to talk about him to those who were waiting for redemption. After centuries of so-called silence, 2 elderly people become witnesses that God had not forgotten his promises. Perhaps they were not considered important by the system, but they were spiritually awake. This teaches us that recognizing God's action does not depend only on information. Many knew the prophecies. Simeon and Anna had, in addition to knowledge, sensitivity. Their hearts were not hardened by time. The long wait did not turn them into bitter people. They didn't say, "We've waited too long. We don't believe in anything anymore." They remained attentive. They continued praying. They continued waiting. And when the greeting came in the form of a child, they recognized him. There are people who, after some disappointments, close their hearts. They continue to attend religious places, but they no longer expect anything. They sing, but without hope. They pray, but they believe they will not be heard. Read the promises only as words addressed to other people. The 400 years of silence confront us with a choice. Will the time of waiting make us deeper or colder? Not everyone reacted the same way. Some abandoned allegiance to adapt. Others became violent. Some turned tradition into pride. Others negotiated with the powerful. But there were those who continued to wait humbly. Zechariah and Elizabeth, Mary and Joseph, Simeon, Anna, pastors who heard the news. Ordinary people carrying extraordinary hope. When the time came, God didn't just look for the big centers, found available hearts. Perhaps you are living through a period that seems silent. You pray and don't notice a change. He seeks direction and finds few answers. It carries a promise, but the months pass. Look around and everything seems to remain the same. It is important not to use the biblical story to promise that every personal desire will be fulfilled exactly as we imagine. Not every expectation is born from a divine promise. But we can learn something safe. Silence does not prove abandonment. The absence of an immediate response does not mean that God has lost control. During those centuries, one could look at Judea and conclude that the promises had failed. The people were dominated. The temple had suffered desecration. The rulers were corrupt. Foreigners controlled the land. No son of David occupied the throne. But the lineage continued. The scriptures continued. Hope continued. And on a night that seemed ordinary, in a small town, the promise was born. Maybe God is acting in places you can't yet see. As you watch a closed door, He may be forming maturity. While you regret a delay, He may be preparing people, circumstances, and paths. While you wonder why nothing changes, perhaps important changes are already happening beyond your eyes. This doesn't take away the pain of waiting. Mary received a promise, but faced misunderstanding. Jose received guidance, but he needed to protect his family. Jesus was born as a king, but he was not received in a palace. Fulfillment of God does not mean absence of difficulties. Sometimes it is precisely within the difficulties that the promise begins to take shape. If this message is speaking to your heart, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Here we are not just looking for biblical information, but connections capable of illuminating our journey. And write a simple sentence in the comments. God continues to act in silence. This statement can be empowering to someone else reading this who is going through a period of waiting. There is yet another lesson hidden in this story. God's silence exposed people's hearts. When there is a clear prophetic voice, many show obedience because they feel watched or pressured. When time passes, what really exists inside each person begins to appear. Some priests transformed service into an opportunity for power. Some rulers used faith to legitimize ambitions. Some people traded beliefs for cultural acceptance. Others remained faithful even under threat. The silence acted as a kind of mirror. It revealed those who sought God only for results and those who remained faithful by recognizing His value. This also happens to us. When we feel comfort, we say we trust. When the doors open, we affirm that God is good. When we receive answers, our faith seems strong. But what happens when we don't feel anything? What happens when prayer doesn't seem to reach the ceiling? What happens when no one applauds our loyalty? What happens when obeying doesn't produce a visible reward? This is where the roots are tested. A tree does not develop deep roots during constant light rain. Often it is the search for water in dry periods that forces it to go deeper. The 400 years were a long period of deepening for part of the people. Messianic hope took on new forms. The scriptures were studied intensely. Communities were established in distant lands. Jewish identity was preserved in the face of enormous pressures. There were also mistakes, radicalism, and divisions. But faith did not disappear. When Jesus was born, there were people ready to hear him because previous generations had preserved the words. We often celebrate those who reap, but forget those who sowed. John the Baptist announced that the kingdom was near, but before him there were fathers and mothers teaching the law to their children. The disciples quoted the prophets, but before them there were scribes carefully copying the texts. Paul announced in synagogues, but before him there were communities that built and maintained these spaces. The crowds were waiting for the Messiah because their stories and promises had been passed down. Some people participated in the preparation without seeing the result. This did not make his loyalty useless. Maybe you are doing something whose fruit will be seen by another generation. Maybe you are teaching a child, preserving values, writing a message, helping someone, praying for a family, serving without recognition. Don't despise small loyalties. Much of the preparation for Jesus' arrival happened through people whose names we do not know. They don't appear on the most famous pages. They performed no known miracles. They did not govern nations. They just continued. And continuing can also be a profound form of faith. The Bible passes from Malachi to Matthew in a single page, but human history has not passed so quickly. There were children who were born and died. There were weddings, funerals, harvests and droughts. There were people who celebrated festivals in the temple. There were families who lost children in wars. There were sincere priests and corrupt priests. There were people attracted to Greek culture and others persecuted for rejecting it. There were soldiers marching down the roads. There were mothers telling stories about Abraham, Moses, and David. There were men looking up to the sky and asking when the deliverer would come. 4 centuries are not just a date on a timeline. There are millions of human experiences. When we call this period silent, we need to remember that real people lived through it. They did not know that they were in the gap between 2 testaments. They didn't know how many years were left. They did not know that their descendants would know Jesus. For them, the next day was just another day. It's easy to see a plan once we know the ending. It's much harder to trust while we're in the process. We know that after Malachi comes Matthew. They didn't know. We know that John the Baptist would appear. They didn't know. We know that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. They didn't know. We know that the cross would not be the end. The disciples that Friday still did not understand. Faith exists precisely in this space between what God promised and what our eyes can see. The intertestamental period also shows how people can try to speed up or fabricate the fulfillment of promises. Some believed that liberation would come through a military revolt. Others sought to preserve power through political alliances. Some isolated themselves, hoping for supernatural intervention. Others tried to control holiness by increasingly detailed rules. Each group had a response to the crisis. Jesus did not completely fit into any of them. He did not adopt the accommodation of those who benefited from Rome. He did not embrace revolutionary violence. He did not abandon the cities to form an isolated community. It did not transform the law into an instrument of superiority. He walked among the people. He called disciples from different backgrounds. Among them was a tax collector, seen as a collaborator with Rome, and also Simon, called a zealot, linked to a completely different perspective. In any other context, these men could be enemies. Around Jesus, they needed to learn a new identity. The kingdom brought together people who human systems kept separate. This was a deeper revolution. It didn't start with taking the palace. It began with the transformation of the heart. Jesus did not say that injustice did not matter. He confronted exploitation, hypocrisy, and lack of mercy. But he knew that replacing one ruler with another would not solve the problem if the human heart continued to be dominated by the same ambition. The history of the Hasmoneans had already demonstrated this. A family started fighting for religious freedom. Later, their descendants were involved in disputes, power, and violence. External change did not guarantee internal loyalty. Therefore, Jesus announced a new birth. He spoke about purity of heart. He taught that greatness lies in serving. He said that the leader should become like the one who waits at the table. He ordered forgiveness. He called the peacemakers blessed. He taught us to love even our enemies. These words were not weakness. They were a direct attack on the logic that governed empires. Rome said, "Defeat your enemies." Jesus said, "Love your enemies." Herod said, "Eliminate anyone who threatens your power." Jesus said, "Give your life." The rulers said, "Be served." Jesus knelt down and washed feet. The world said, "Accumulate." Jesus said, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be." The kingdom of God did not repeat the structure of human kingdoms. Maybe that's why it was so difficult to understand. After 400 years of waiting for a liberator, many imagined a more powerful version of the kings they already knew. God sent a completely different king. His crown would be of thorns. Your visible throne, El, would be a cross. His victory would emerge from apparent defeat. His army would be made up of witnesses. His message would advance not by the sword, but by announcement, by service, and by love. Empires conquered territories. Jesus won hearts without forcing anyone. Rome controlled bodies. Christ offered inner freedom. Herod built monuments to preserve memory. Jesus wrote his message in people's lives. It is impossible to understand the power of these images without looking at the centuries that came before. The wait for the kingdom was everywhere. The expression kingdom of God was not an empty religious phrase. For a people subjected to empires, saying that God would reign was a declaration full of hope. It meant that Rome would not have the last word. It meant that unjust kings would be judged. It meant that the covenant would be remembered. It meant restoration. But Jesus expanded on that expectation. The kingdom was already approaching through his presence, although it still awaited its complete manifestation. Where the sick were restored, the kingdom gave signs. Where sinners were forgiven, the kingdom appeared. Where excluded people were welcomed, the kingdom confronted barriers. Where the truth was announced, darkness lost space. The kingdom was not just a territory on the map. It was God's government reaching lives. This did not eliminate future hope for justice, but it showed that transformation could now begin. The 400 years also help us understand why the genealogy presented at the beginning of Matthew is so important. Many readers quickly skim past that list of names. It just seems like a difficult sequence to pronounce, but genealogy conveys a message. God preserved history. Kings have risen and fallen. Families faced exile. The nation lost its independence. Centuries of silence passed. Still, the line reached Jesus. Genealogy works as a bridge over silence. She says the seemingly empty years haven't stopped the promise. Each generation carried the thread forward. Some people on that list were faithful. Others made serious mistakes. Some are known. Others barely appear in the story. Still, God carried out the plan through a human family marked by grace and fragility. This also prevents us from turning salvation history into a legend about perfect people. Jesus entered a royal genealogy, a story with sins, losses, foreigners, flawed kings, and unexpected situations. He did not come because humanity finally became worthy. He came because humanity needed to be saved. Grace is not the prize given to an impeccable family. It is God's action within a broken story. When Matthew begins with the genealogy, he is silently responding to 400 years. The promise did not die. David's son arrived. Abraham's son arrived. The blessing destined for the nations was entering a new stage. Then the gospel presents us with the wise men who came from the east. They observe a sign and travel in search of the king. While many Jerusalem leaders do not move, foreigners cross a long distance. This contrast is striking. The people had the scriptures. The priests knew how to indicate that the Messiah should be born in Bethlehem. They offer the correct information to Herod. But knowing the location doesn't mean walking there. The wise men had less information, but they moved. The experts knew the answer, but they stayed. This shows us that spiritual information without disposition can become sterile. You can know where Bethlehem is and never find Jesus. You can know prophecies and not surrender. You can explain texts and not allow them to transform your life. You can defend the temple and not recognize the presence of God. The 400 years produced much knowledge, but Jesus would seek something beyond. Living faith. Not a faith without thought, not a faith that despises the Scriptures, but a faith in which knowledge leads to encounter. The story between Malachi and Jesus also reminds us that God does not belong to a single language or territory. The Scriptures have been translated. Jews lived in different regions. Foreigners showed interest in Israel's faith. When Jesus arrived, his message began among the Jewish people, respecting the history of the covenant. Then, it crossed borders. At Pentecost, people from different regions heard the proclamation. Later, the disciples faced a difficult question. Did non-Jews need to adopt the full Jewish cultural identity to follow Jesus? This discussion can only be understood within a world already connected by the diaspora, the Greek language, and Roman roots. Silence had prepared an international world. The message born in a small region would be taken to cities in Asia, Greece, Macedonia, and even Rome. Paul would travel on roads built for the empire. I would write in Greek. I would enter synagogues established by diaspora communities. I would talk to Jews and Gentiles familiar with different philosophies. The gospel would find a world prepared to communicate, but deeply in need of hope. Greek culture had philosophy, but it did not eliminate human anguish. Rome had strength, but it did not produce true peace. Judea had the temple, but many hearts remained far away. Religious groups had interpretations, but they were unable to reconcile the nation. The world had roads, but I didn't know where to go. It had tongues, but it needed a message. He had kings, but he was waiting for the true king. He had altars, but he did not fully know the God who wanted to dwell among human beings. Then Jesus declared himself to be the way, not just someone who shows a way, the path itself. He declared it to be the truth in a world full of competing voices. He declared himself to be life in a reality marked by the dominance of death. Centuries of silence created the question. Jesus presented the answer in his own person. Perhaps this is why the Gospels have such an intense urgency. The kingdom has come close. The time has passed. The promise is no longer just in the future. Repent, believe, follow. The wait had been long, but the moment required decision. It was not enough to say our ancestors waited for the Messiah. Now the Messiah was calling people by name. Pedro needed to leave the net. Matthew needed to get up from the tax table. Nicodemus needed to be born again. The Samaritan woman needed to face the truth about her life. The rich young man needed to decide where his treasure was. Pilate needed to answer what he would do with Jesus. Each person found the promise and needed to position themselves. Us too. We can study the 400 years, admire the chronology, learn the names of empires, and remain far from the center of history. The center is not Alexandria. It's not Judas Maccabeus. It's not Pompey. It's not Herod. The center is Jesus. All events form the setting. He is the arrival. Historical knowledge should lead us to see Christ with greater clarity, not just accumulate information. When we realize how long the people waited, the birth of Jesus stops seeming like a delicate, isolated scene. It becomes the silent explosion of a hope held for centuries. The manger carries the weight of promises. The boy's crying breaks the long night. The footsteps of the shepherds announce that the humble are being invited. The star shows that the message will reach the nations. Herod's fear reveals that human powers have perceived a threat. Mary's song declares that the proud will not remain forever. Zechariah's praise announces that light will visit those who live in darkness. Everything connects. The silence did not end with a political noise. It ended with God approaching. And this is perhaps what we most need to understand. When God seems silent, we tend to ask for an explanation. He often offers presence. We want a complete map. He calls us to take the next step. We want to know why it took so long. He shows us that he has not abandoned us. We want an answer that eliminates all questions. He presents us with Christ. The people expected deliverance, direction, justice, forgiveness, and restoration. In Jesus, these hopes find a center. He did not respond to all expectations in the way imagined, but he revealed something greater than them. God did not just send a solution to a temporary political problem. He sent his Son to begin a new creation. Therefore, the cross cannot be separated from the manger. Jesus was born within Roman rule and died at the hands of that system, but death was unable to retain him. The resurrection declared that no empire, no sin, and no tomb has the final say. The 400 years seemed like one long night. The resurrection shows that even the night of the tomb has a limit. The silent Saturday between the cross and the resurrection sums up, in a certain way, this entire mystery. Jesus was placed in the tomb. The stone was closed. The disciples hid. No explanation seemed sufficient. The promises seemed defeated. The sky seemed silent. But while the disciples wept, the story was not yet over. The morning arrived. This pattern appears again. Silence is not necessarily the end. Grave is not necessarily defeat. Waiting is not necessarily abandonment. The absence of visible movement does not mean the absence of power. On the third day, what seemed closed was transformed. Maybe you came to this video carrying a question that no one knows about. Perhaps there is an area of your life that seems stuck between Malachi and Matthew. You receive a word but has not yet seen the fulfillment. One chapter has ended, but the next has not yet started. There is no clear new direction. You look at the blank page and feel scared. The 400 years remind us that between two chapters there is history. Even when you can't read it. Even when events seem disconnected. Even when the response doesn't arrive at the expected rate. Keep seeking wisdom. Keep doing good. Continue preserving what is true. Remain willing to be corrected. Stay alert, because fulfillment may come in a different way than imagined. But don't use waiting as an excuse to remain paralyzed either. The faithful of that period did not just look at the sky. They built communities. They taught their children. They copied the scriptures. They prayed. They worked. They resisted when necessary. They helped preserve the identity of the people. Waiting on God does not mean abandoning responsibilities. It means living faithfully until we have all the answers. Mary received a promise and followed the path. Jose received guidance and got up to obey. The wise men saw the sign and traveled. The shepherds heard the announcement and went to Bethlehem. Simeon waited, but also went to the temple. Hannah prayed, and when she saw Jesus, she spoke about him. Biblical waiting is active. He does not try to control God, but keeps his heart available. After knowing everything that happened during this period, the expression, 400 years of silence, takes on a new meaning. They were years without a new prophetic voice recognized by many traditions, but they were not years without history, faith, conflict, or preparation. The world of Malachi was slowly transformed into the world of Matthew. Persian gave way to Greek. Greek was divided between dynasties. The Sadducees pursued. The Maccabees resisted. The Hasmoneans ruled. Rome conquered. Herod built it. Religious groups organized themselves. The synagogues became stronger. The scriptures circulated in other languages. Messianic hope grew. Then John cried out in the wilderness and Jesus appeared. None of this happened all at once. The preparation spanned generations. Therefore, when someone says that God was not doing anything, remember, silence was only the part that human beings could perceive. Beneath the surface, languages, roads, communities, ideas, conflicts, and expectations were converging. We don't need to pretend that every cruel event was good. We don't need to say that every war was necessary. But we can say that no war was able to stop the promise. No empire was able to erase it. No king was able to buy it. No corrupt leadership was able to cancel it. No human delay could make it disappear. When the time came, Jesus was born. And perhaps this is the phrase that sums up the entire period. When the time has come. Not when Herod wished. Not when Rome authorized it. Not when everyone understood. Not when the world has become worthy. When the time has come. There is a difference between delay and preparation. To those who wait, both may seem the same. Only later can we look back and notice connections. The people needed freedom, but they also needed to discover that the deepest freedom would not be produced by military victory alone. He needed a king, but he would learn that the true king is not like human tyrants. He needed the temple, but he would discover that God wanted to form a people in whom his presence would dwell. He needed sacrifice, but he would find in Christ a surrender capable of reconciliation. He needed a new word, but he received the Word made flesh. Silence prepared questions that only Jesus would fully answer. Who can overcome sin? Who can reveal the Father? Who can touch the unclean without becoming unclean? Who can face death and return? Who can bring Jews and Gentiles together in the same spiritual family? Who can offer a kingdom that does not end when an empire falls? Jesus. This is why history cannot stop at Malachi. It also cannot stop at the Maccabees. It cannot stop at the rebuilt temple. It cannot stop at political independence. You can't stop in Rome. Everything points to the arrival of Christ. And when he arrives, the silence reveals that it was never empty. I was full of expectation, like the pause before a song starts, like the darkness before the dawn, like the earth hiding a seed, like the womb guarding a life that has not yet been seen. For centuries, the promise remained beneath the surface. Then he was born in Bethlehem. If you know someone who is going through a time of silence, share this video with them. Maybe she doesn't need an easy explanation. Maybe you just need to remember that a silent page is not the last page, and keep this truth. Between Malachi and Matthew, God did not lose control. Between promise and fulfillment, God did not forget his people. Between Persian and Roman rule, history did not leave his hands. Between the last prophetic voice and the cry of John the Baptist, hope did not die. The silence was long. Empires seemed invincible. The people were divided. The faith of many had weakened. But when no one expected that something great could start in such a simple place, a child was born. Herod slept in his palace. Soldiers guarded the roads. Priests maintained the rituals. Rome counted its subjects. And, in a manger, the true king breathed for the first time among us. The world almost didn't notice. But the silence of 400 years was over.